Welcome to Dark Domain, the place where you'll rethink camping trips, river adventures, and owning a mirror. Because who needs self-reflection when the reflection starts staring back, right? We're diving deep into 3 chilling tales that'll have you double-checking your surroundings. Now, if you're brave enough to stay until the end, make sure to hit that like button. Trust me, it's the safest thing you'll do today. And if you survive the video, hit subscribe. You'll need the company. Now here's a question for you. If you were stuck in one of these creepy stories, what would be your weapon of choice? Let us know in the comments. Now, buckle up. Things are about to get bumpy. The Beast of Pine Valley. There are places you don't go after dark. Everyone in Lexington knows that Pine Valley is one of those places. It's not far from the city, but it feels like another world once you pass through the thick trees that line the valley. The locals have always had stories about it, about strange noises, shadowy figures, and something that roams the woods at night. Most people chalk it up to superstition, a way to keep kids from wandering too far into the woods. But the stories are real. I'm Caleb Hart, a wildlife officer with the Kentucky Department of Fish and Wildlife. I've spent the last 10 years patrolling state parks, managing wildlife, and dealing with the occasional bear or mountain lion sighting. I thought I'd seen it all until last week. It started with a call about a hiker who had gone missing near Pine Valley. Not unusual for this time of year. People always underestimate how easy it is to get lost in the dense woods. But something about this case felt off. The hiker, Tommy Harris, had been an experienced outdoorsman. He knew these trails better than most. His wife had reported him missing after he failed to come home from his usual hike. The search teams had already gone out combing the area for hours, but they hadn't found anything. No sign of Tommy. No footprints, no gear, not even a scrap of clothing. It was like he had vanished. When I arrived at the trailhead, the sun was already dipping below the horizon, casting long shadows through the trees. The air was cool, the kind of crisp chill that comes right before winter sets in. I met up with Sheriff Thomas, who had been coordinating the search. "No sign of him yet," the sheriff said, shaking his head. "But something about this doesn't sit right with me. He was too good to just get lost." I nodded. I'd seen enough cases like this to know when something wasn't adding up. "You find anything unusual?" I asked. The sheriff hesitated. "One thing. We found some tracks about a mile up the trail, but they weren't human. Could be a bear, but I don't know. They were too big." I frowned. Bears were rare in this part of Kentucky, but it wasn't impossible. Still, the way the sheriff looked at me, I could tell there was more he wasn't saying. I headed up the trail, following the path the search team had already cleared. It was quiet, unnervingly so. No birds, no rustling leaves, just the soft crunch of my boots on the dirt. After about half a mile, I found the tracks the sheriff had mentioned. They were deep, wide, and clawed, like something heavy had passed through here. But they didn't look like bear tracks. Not exactly. They were longer, the claws sharper, more defined. I knelt down, running my hand over one of the prints. Whatever made these was big, bigger than anything I'd ever seen in these woods. The sun had nearly set by the time I reached the top of the ridge overlooking Pine Valley. The trees stretched out in every direction, a sea of dark green against the fading light. That's when I heard it. A low, guttural growl echoing through the valley. I froze, my hand instinctively going to the radio strapped to my belt. I scanned the tree line, trying to pinpoint where the sound had come from, but it seemed to come from everywhere at once. Then, in the distance, something moved. A shadow darted between the trees, too fast for me to get a good look. But it was big, easily taller than a man, its body hunched, moving on all fours. For a second, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me, but then I saw it again. The creature stopped just at the edge of the clearing, barely visible in the fading light. It was watching me. I slowly backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. Whatever it wasn't afraid of me. And it wasn't a bear. The next morning, I returned to the valley with a full team. more officers, a few park rangers, and the sheriff. I told them what I had seen, but I could tell they didn't believe me. The tracks were still there, but the creature was gone. We spent the better part of the day searching the valley, but there was no sign of Tommy or the creature. By dusk, most of the team had given up, heading back to town with nothing to show for it. But I couldn't let it go. I stayed behind, determined to find something, anything, that would explain what was happening. As night fell, I returned to the ridge where I'd seen the creature. The air was thick with tension, the kind you feel when you know something's watching you. I didn't have to wait long. Just after midnight, I heard the growl again, low, rumbling, and much closer than before. I turned, my flashlight cutting through the darkness, and there it was. The creature stood at the edge of the trees, its hulking body silhouetted against the night. It was massive, at least 7 feet tall, with long, muscular limbs and thick, matted fur. Its eyes glowed faintly in the beam of my flashlight, reflecting a cold animal intelligence. But what struck me the most was its face. It wasn't entirely animal. There was something almost human in its features, something primal, ancient, and terrifying. I took a step back, my mind racing. I knew I had to run, but my feet felt rooted to the ground. The creature let out a snarl and started toward me, its movements fast and fluid, like it was gliding over the earth. My body finally kicked into gear. I turned and bolted down the trail, the sound of the creature crashing through the trees behind me. My breath came in ragged gasps, the cold air burning my lungs as I sprinted for the truck. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it, closer now, gaining on me. I reached the truck and threw myself inside, slamming the door just as the creature barreled out of the woods. It stopped short, its massive body silhouetted against the headlights, its eyes locked on mine. For a moment, we stared at each other, neither of us moving. Then, without warning, the creature turned and disappeared back into the trees, vanishing as quickly as it had appeared. I filed my report the next day, but no one believed me. The official story is that Tommy Harris got lost, wandered too far off the trail, and died of exposure. They never found his body, but that's the explanation they went with. It was easier than the truth. But I know what I saw. There's something in Pine Valley, something that's been living there for years, maybe longer. It's fast, it's powerful, and it's hunting. And it's still out there. The Black River. They call it the Black River, a stretch of water just outside Lafayette, Louisiana. On the map, it's nothing special, one of countless rivers winding through the dense swamps and bayous. But the locals know better. They tell stories about it, passed down through generations, stories about things that shouldn't exist. My name is Luke Carson, and until a few weeks ago, I didn't believe in any of that. I was a wildlife biologist, in town for a project studying migratory bird patterns in the bayou. My life was all about science, facts, and evidence. If you couldn't measure it or explain it, it didn't exist. But then I saw the river. It started when one of the locals, an older man named Earl, told me about the disappearances. He ran a small bait shop near the docks, the kind of place you stop at for a cold beer and some fishing supplies. I was in there picking up a few things when Earl leaned across the counter and asked me if I'd heard about the Black River curse. I laughed it off at first, but Earl was serious. People been going missing out there for as long as I can remember, he said, his voice low. First it was fishermen, then campers, kids. Some folks say it's the river itself. It don't like people poking around where they don't belong. I nodded, humoring him. What do they think it is? Gators? The water? Earl shook his head. Ain't no gator big enough to do what I've seen. The river. It's got something else. Something that don't belong to this world. I thanked him, bought my supplies, and left. I didn't think much of it until the next day, when I found out one of the other biologists on my team, a guy named Chris, had gone missing. He'd taken a canoe out on the river the previous afternoon to collect water samples and never came back. At first, we thought he might have gotten lost or had an accident, but when we found his canoe the next morning, something didn't add up. It was floating near the shore. There was no sign of Chris. The local authorities did a search, but after a few days they wrote it off as an accident. Maybe he'd fallen out, and the current took him. But I knew better. I'd been on that river. The current was slow, sluggish. Something had happened out there, something we couldn't explain. The more I thought about it, the more Earl's words came back to me. About the river, the disappearances. I couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening out there, it wasn't normal. So I decided to find out for myself. That evening, I borrowed a small motorboat from one of the locals and headed out on the Black River. The sun was setting, casting a golden glow over the water, but even in the daylight, the place felt wrong. The trees loomed overhead, their branches tangled like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. The water was dark, almost black and thick with algae and silt. The deeper I went, the quieter it got. The usual sounds of the swamp, birds, insects, the distant croak of frogs, faded until there was nothing but the gentle hum of the boat's engine. I stopped the boat near the spot where we'd found Chris's canoe. The air was thick, humid, and still. I cut the engine and let the boat drift, listening. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a ripple in the water, barely noticeable. But then something massive moved beneath the surface, dark and slow, like a shadow passing under the boat. I stood up, peering over the edge, but the water was too murky to see anything clearly. I told myself it was just a gator, maybe a big one, but deep down I knew that wasn't it. Suddenly the boat lurched, tipping violently to the side. I grabbed the edge, trying to steady myself, but something was pulling the boat down. I looked over the edge and saw something. Long, pale shapes coiling beneath the surface like the tentacles of an octopus, but too thin, too long. They wrapped around the boat, tightening, dragging it down. Panic set in. I scrambled for the engine, trying to restart it, but the boat was tipping too far. The water was rising around me, the blackness swallowing everything. Then I heard it, a sound I'll never forget. A low, guttural growl vibrating through the water, through the air, through me. It wasn't an animal, wasn't anything I'd ever heard before. It was ancient, angry, alive. The boat tipped completely and I was thrown into the water. The cold hit me like a shock, knocking the wind from my lungs. I flailed, trying to swim, but the water was thick, pulling me down. I could feel something moving beneath me, something massive, circling, waiting. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw them. Shapes, pale and distorted, moving through the water like ghosts. They weren't fish, weren't animals. They were people, or at least, they had been. Their eyes were hollow, their skin stretched and bloated, their mouths open in silent screams. They floated just beneath the surface, their hands reaching for me, pulling me down, down into the black. I fought, kicking and thrashing, but their grip was cold, unrelenting. My vision blurred as the world went dark, the water filling my lungs. And then, nothing. I woke up the next morning, lying on the riverbank, soaked to the bone. My boat was gone, the river calm and still, as if nothing had happened. I don't know how I survived. I don't know what pulled me out, or why. But I knew one thing for sure. I wasn't going back to that river. Chris was never found, and no one believed my story. They said it was the heat, the stress of the job getting to me. But I know what I saw. I know what's out there. The Black River isn't just water. It's alive, and it's hungry. The Mirror's Eye. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. As a photographer, I've spent my life capturing the world as it is, through the lens of my camera. I trust what I can see, what I can control. But recently, I've come to understand that not everything can be explained by light and shadows. Not everything is in focus, even when the lens says it is. My name is Adam Walker, and this is a story I never thought I'd tell. It started 2 months ago when I moved back to Providence. I had been away for years, chasing photography gigs across the country, but the city had a way of calling me back. The familiar brick buildings, the narrow streets, the old charm. It was all still here. I set up my studio in a small, quiet part of town, hoping to settle down and find work doing portraits, weddings, and maybe a few art pieces on the side. The studio was perfect. A large room with windows that let in the soft, golden light of the New England sun, and an old mirror that the previous tenant had left behind, leaning against the wall. The mirror was tall, framed in dark wood worn at the edges with a few cracks spiderwebbing across the glass. I thought it added character to the place. I didn't know then that the mirror had a history, or that it had its own way of seeing the world. My first few weeks in the studio were uneventful. I had a steady stream of clients, local families, couples, and even a few tourists passing through. I'd position them in front of the old mirror, using it as a prop to add depth to the portraits. The photos came out beautifully. The clients were happy. Life was good. But then the strange photos started appearing. I was reviewing a set of portraits late one night, flipping through the shots I had taken earlier that day. A family of 4, standing in front of the mirror, smiling at the camera. But in one of the shots, something was off. I zoomed in on the reflection in the mirror, and there, in the glass, was a figure. A woman standing just behind the family, her face blurred and distorted, as if she were in mid-scream. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. I hadn't seen anyone else in the studio that day. The door had been locked. There was no way someone could have been there without me noticing. I checked the other photos in the set. Nothing. Just that one frame, the woman's face twisted in silent terror, trapped in the mirror. I told myself it was a trick of the light, maybe a glitch in the camera. But the next day, it happened again. This time it was a portrait of a young couple. They were standing in front of the mirror, holding hands, smiling nervously as I snapped their photo. But when I reviewed the images, the reflection showed something else entirely. The couple's faces were contorted, eyes wide with fear, mouths open in a silent scream. The room behind them looked warped, as if the mirror had twisted reality into something darker, something grotesque. I didn't show them the photos. I couldn't. Over the next week, the strange reflections continued. Every time I took a portrait in front of the mirror, the photos would show people as they were. But their reflections were different. Distorted. Afraid. I stopped using the mirror after that, but it didn't stop the images. One evening I noticed something strange. It wasn't just the reflections that were off anymore. The photos themselves were changing. The people I had photographed, their faces would shift, their expressions would turn from happiness to fear, from calm to panic. And in the background, always lurking, was the woman. The same blurred, screaming figure I had seen in the mirror. It didn't make sense. There was no logical explanation for what was happening. I checked my camera, my equipment. Everything was fine. But the photos kept changing, growing more disturbing by the day. It was as if the mirror had somehow infected my work, warping the images into something I couldn't control. Then the nightmares started. Every night I dreamt of the woman. She was always standing in front of the mirror, her back to me, her long hair matted and tangled, her clothes drenched in shadows. In the dream, I would call out to her, ask her who she was, but she never turned around. She would just stand there staring into the mirror, her reflection twisted and broken. And every night I would wake up in a cold sweat, the same words echoing in my mind. She sees you. One night, after another sleepless stretch, I couldn't take it anymore. I grabbed my camera, pointed it at the mirror, and snapped a photo. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some kind of proof that I wasn't losing my mind. I pulled the image up on my screen and stared at it, my hands shaking. There in the reflection was the woman. She was closer now, her face clear. Her eyes were hollow, her mouth frozen in a silent scream. But this time, something was different. She wasn't standing still. She was reaching out, her hand pressed against the glass as if she were trying to push through. And in the corner of the image, I saw something that made my blood run cold. My reflection, standing beside her, staring back at me. I tore the mirror off the wall that night, shattering it into pieces. I thought it would end the nightmare, that destroying the mirror would somehow free me from whatever curse it had brought into my life. But the next morning when I woke up, I found a photograph lying on the floor of my studio. A photograph I hadn't taken. It was of me, standing in front of the shattered mirror, my face contorted in fear. And in the broken shards of glass at my feet, I saw her, the woman, still watching. Thanks for diving into the darkness with us here at Dark Domain. If you enjoyed the thrills and chills, make sure to hit that like button, because nothing says, "I'm not scared," like a thumbs up. And if you haven't already, don't forget to subscribe so you don't miss out on our next descent into the eerie and unexplained. Until next time, keep your lights on and your mirrors covered. You never know who's watching.